The alarm screamed through the steel corridors just as the ocean began to rise violently around the vessel, lights flickering, metal groaning, men running as water slammed against reinforced hulls with a force no one had trained for. This was not a drill and it was not expected. Somewhere deep below, something had moved, and the sea itself seemed to react. The classified submarine operation was already 6 hours behind schedule when pressure readings spiked without warning. Sonar screens filled with shapes that made no sense, massive outlines rising from below the deepest known charts. At 11,000 meters beneath the Pacific, where darkness was supposed to rule and life was meant to be impossible, the ocean floor was no longer still. This was the moment Commander Nathan Hale would later describe as the point of no return, though at the time no one on board understood what had truly been crossed. The mission logs would later call it a geological anomaly, then erase even that phrase. But the crew felt it before they saw it. The water temperature shifted. Instruments behaved like they were being watched. Silence fell across the control room in a way that had nothing to do with discipline. The sub descended slowly, its reinforced shell creaking under pressure that could crush cities. Outside, the darkness was absolute, thicker than night, heavier than fear. Then lights appeared. Not reflections. Not bioluminescence. Lights arranged in patterns, vast and deliberate, stretching across the seafloor like streets seen from the sky. Structures followed, towering shapes rising from the abyss, smooth and symmetrical, too precise to be natural. Massive underwater cities stood where nothing should exist, ancient yet untouched, advanced yet impossibly old. The sub slowed to a halt without being commanded. Control systems lagged, then froze. Navigation failed. The crew was no longer in control of their own vessel. The ocean around them felt alive, not in a wild or chaotic way, but in a calm, observing presence. Every man on board sensed it, a quiet certainty that they were not alone, and never had been. Commander Hale had served 24 years in the United States Navy, through wars, classified operations, and disasters that never made the news. He had faced death in open water and silence beneath the ice. Nothing prepared him for this. Nothing in military training explained the feeling of being studied by something older than recorded history. The cities below were not ruins. They were active. Energy fields rippled across their surfaces, shielding them from the crushing weight of the ocean. Movement could be seen within, slow and deliberate, shapes gliding through transparent corridors. No bubbles. No decay. No signs of struggle against the environment. Whatever lived there had mastered the deep long before humans learned to sail. Orders came through encrypted channels, sharp and immediate. Observe. Record. Do not engage. Do not descend further. Do not attempt communication. The mission parameters shifted instantly, fear hiding beneath official language. This was no longer exploration. This was containment. Data streamed back to command satellites above the surface, then abruptly stopped. Communication blacked out. The sub-systems restarted on their own, as if released. The lights below dimmed, not fading but withdrawing, like a city choosing to turn its back. Within minutes, the ocean returned to silence. The cities vanished into darkness as if they had never existed. Sonar showed empty seabed again. Pressure normalized. Control was restored. The official report would later state that a system malfunction caused hallucinations under extreme stress. The crew would be separated, reassigned, sworn to silence under lifetime national security orders. Records would be sealed, footage classified beyond top secret. Families would never know why their sons came home changed. Commander Hale carried that secret for 30 years. Now 65, his body weakened by terminal lung cancer, the weight of that night presses harder than the disease itself. Time has stripped away fear of consequences. Promotions no longer matter. Clearance levels are meaningless. What remains is memory, sharp and unrelenting. He remembers the calm of the cities, the sense of intelligence without aggression, the realization that humanity was not first, not alone, and not as advanced as it believed. He remembers understanding, in that moment, why the oceans have always been treated as forbidden depths rather than frontiers. Since 1994, strange events have followed patterns that few connect. Unexplained naval disappearances. Deep-sea cables severed without cause. Sonar contacts dismissed as errors. Whistleblowers silenced. The ocean has been speaking quietly, and power has chosen not to listen. Hale's illness has removed the last barrier. This story is not about belief. It is about testimony. About a man who followed orders his entire life and now chooses truth over silence. What he reveals challenges evolution, history, and humanity's assumed dominance of Earth. Chapter 1 ends here, at the edge of that descent, where the sea opened its eyes and then closed them again. Because what was seen beneath the Pacific was only the beginning. If this chapter unsettled you, if it stirred questions you were never taught to ask, then you need to stay with this story. Subscribe now, because the deeper this testimony goes, the more dangerous the truth becomes, and what waits in the next line was never meant to surface. The first sign that the discovery had changed policy came quietly, without announcements or headlines, as naval maps were redrawn overnight and routes that had existed for decades were suddenly marked restricted. Ships were rerouted hundreds of miles out of their way. Research vessels lost funding without explanation. The ocean floor, once mapped for curiosity and commerce, became a boundary again. Within weeks of the 1994 mission, new programs appeared inside classified budgets, hidden under harmless names that suggested maintenance and safety. In reality, they focused on one thing only, watching the deep without being seen. Sonar arrays were expanded. Listening stations were planted along the Pacific Rim. The goal was not contact. It was early warning. Marcus Sullivan watched these changes from the inside, not as a decision-maker but as a man who understood their meaning. The world's most powerful navy had accepted a truth it would never admit publicly. Something intelligent lived beneath the ocean, and it did not belong to humanity. Training protocols changed too. Submarine crews were briefed on pressure hallucinations more than ever before. Psychological evaluations became stricter. Any sailor who reported unusual lights or patterns was quietly reassigned. The system learned quickly how to filter truth before it reached the surface. Years passed, but the ocean did not remain silent. Unexplained sonar contacts increased, appearing briefly and then vanishing, always at depths considered unreachable. Autonomous underwater vehicles stopped returning. Official reports blamed mechanical failure, yet engineers knew the designs were sound. Something was interfering, not violently, but deliberately. Sullivan noticed the pattern in private logs, the kind never meant for review. Every anomaly followed observation. Every disappearance came after curiosity went too far. The civilization beneath the Pacific was not hiding blindly. It was managing distance. The most unsettling realization came during a classified briefing years later, when a senior analyst referred to the deep ocean not as territory, but as a neighbor. The word slipped out, then vanished from the record. But it stayed with Sullivan. Neighbors observe. Neighbors remember. Public science continued to tell a simpler story. The deepest parts of the ocean were described as barren, lifeless, extreme. Textbooks remained unchanged. Exploration focused upward, toward space, while the greatest mystery on Earth lay sealed beneath miles of water. Sullivan began to feel the weight of complicity. Silence had once felt like duty. Over time, it began to feel like betrayal, not of country, but of humanity. The truth was not dangerous because it threatened lives. It was dangerous because it threatened certainty. The oceans had always shaped civilization. Trade routes. Wars. Climate. Life itself. To accept that another intelligence had shaped them longer and better was to accept that humans were late to their own planet. As decades passed, Sullivan watched global tensions rise and fall, watched technology race forward, watched humanity argue endlessly about the stars while ignoring the depths. He wondered how many conflicts might change if people knew they were not alone here, not in the skies, but beneath their feet. His health declined slowly at first, then rapidly. Breath became work. Sleep became fragmented. With illness came memory, sharper than ever. The lights beneath the Pacific returned in dreams, not as threat, but as reminder. They had been calm. Patient. Unafraid. That calm haunted him more than any nightmare. He understood then that the greatest lie was not denial, but delay. The longer the truth was hidden, the more fragile humanity would be when it finally surfaced. Prepared ignorance was still ignorance. Sullivan began organizing his records with care. Not leaks. Not accusations. A testimony. Dates aligned. Technical details verified. Language stripped of speculation. This was not a story meant to shock. It was meant to endure. He knew others had seen fragments of the same truth. Pilots. Researchers. Sailors. Each holding a piece, each believing they were alone. Silence had isolated them as effectively as secrecy. What he did not know was how close the world had already come to another encounter. How many times the deep had risen to the edge of detection, then withdrawn. How restraint, not fear, had guided the hidden cities below. Chapter 3 ends with understanding taking shape, not of discovery, but of consequence. The mission in 1994 did not end at the surface. It reshaped borders, priorities, and the unspoken agreement between humanity and the ocean. What comes next is not about what was found, but about what was almost revealed, and how close the truth came to escaping control. If this chapter has changed how you think about the sea, then you need to stay with this story. Subscribe now, because the next line reveals the moment the silence nearly broke, and why the world was never meant to hear it. The near exposure did not come from a leak or a whistleblower, but from curiosity moving faster than control. In the early 2000s, civilian technology began closing the gap the military had guarded for decades. Private research companies pushed deeper into the ocean than ever before, driven by ambition, profit, and the belief that the deep was finally within reach. High-resolution sonar improved. Autonomous vehicles grew smarter. Mapping projects promised to reveal the last unknown parts of Earth. What the public saw as progress, those inside classified circles saw as risk. The silence that had held for years began to thin. It started with a research expedition officially funded to study tectonic movement in the Pacific. The mission was civilian, international, and transparent. Its equipment was advanced enough to see patterns older systems could not. Within days, the vessel reported anomalies. Clean geometric outlines. Energy distortions. Structures where there should have been fractured rock. The data was flagged automatically. Military observers did not intervene at first. Watching had become habit. But when the expedition's autonomous drone descended beyond approved depth limits, concern turned to urgency. The drone's feed showed lights, faint but organized, repeating the same symmetry seen decades earlier. This time, the encounter was not controlled. The drone transmitted images long enough to be recorded by civilian scientists before its signal cut out. No explosion. No interference spike. Just silence. The researchers, unaware of the larger truth, began preparing their findings for publication. Peer-reviewed drafts circulated quietly. Questions were asked that should never have been formed. Inside classified channels, alarms sounded without noise. Meetings were called that never appeared on calendars. Old files were reopened. Names long buried resurfaced. Marcus Sullivan was contacted for the first time in years, not to speak, but to listen. The response was swift and surgical. Funding for the expedition was suspended due to safety violations. Legal reviews halted data sharing. Partner institutions were advised to delay publication pending verification. The researchers were not threatened. They were overwhelmed. Bureaucracy buried curiosity better than force ever could. Official explanations followed familiar patterns. Equipment malfunction. Misinterpreted readings. Natural formations. The same words recycled across decades, polished to sound new. Most accepted them. A few did not. Those few were enough. Sullivan understood then how fragile the silence truly was. The ocean had remained hidden not because it was unreachable, but because humanity had chosen not to look too closely. That choice was eroding. What disturbed him most was not the risk of discovery, but the behavior of the civilization below. Once again, there was no aggression. No attempt to communicate. No effort to stop observation directly. The deep responded by withdrawing, allowing humans to explain the encounter away. Restraint had become a pattern. That pattern suggested awareness. Not only of technology, but of psychology. The hidden cities understood how humans reacted to uncertainty, how authority shaped belief, how truth could be diluted without confrontation. Sullivan realized that the greatest mistake was assuming secrecy was permanent. It was not. It was a temporary alignment of ignorance and power. And both were shifting. As his health worsened, the urgency sharpened. He began to see the story not as a confession, but as a warning delayed too long. Humanity was approaching the truth from two directions at once. From above, through space exploration, and from below, through deep-sea technology. The margin for controlled silence was shrinking. He reviewed the civilian drone footage in fragments, enough to confirm what he already knew. The architecture was consistent. The energy signatures unchanged. Time had not altered the cities. If anything, they appeared untouched, as if waiting was part of their design. The realization settled slowly but firmly. Discovery was inevitable. The only variable left was context. Would humanity encounter the truth prepared, or panicked? With understanding, or denial? The fracture did not happen loudly. There was no public argument, no dramatic resignation, no document leaked to the world. It began as a disagreement spoken behind closed doors, measured and careful, but dangerous all the same. For the first time since 1994, silence itself was questioned. Inside restricted rooms where decisions were made without records, two positions slowly formed. One side believed secrecy was still protection. The other began to see it as delay, a fragile wall holding back a future that could no longer be controlled. Both sides understood the same truth. The difference was timing. Advances in civilian technology were accelerating faster than expected. Deep-sea mapping was no longer limited to governments. Universities, corporations, and international coalitions were pushing equipment to depths once considered unreachable. Every new expedition increased the odds of another near exposure, and near exposures were becoming harder to erase. The internal reports grew more urgent. Language softened at first, then sharpened. Words like unlikely and manageable were replaced with inevitable and uncontrolled. The ocean was no longer just being watched. It was being approached. Marcus Sullivan was drawn deeper into these discussions, not as an authority, but as a witness whose experience could not be replicated. He listened as strategists debated humanity's readiness for truth, as if truth were a weapon rather than a fact. He recognized the fear beneath the logic. Control had become identity. Losing it felt like collapse. One argument kept returning, quiet but persistent. If the civilization beneath the Pacific had wanted to remain hidden forever, it could have prevented discovery entirely. Instead, it allowed glimpses. Brief. Non-violent. Enough to be dismissed, but also enough to be remembered. That pattern suggested intention. The idea unsettled everyone who considered it seriously. If the deep was managing disclosure rather than avoiding it, then humanity was not in control of the timeline. It was reacting to it. Another classified briefing shifted the tone completely. A long-term projection showed civilian deep-sea capabilities crossing a critical threshold within 2 decades. At that point, denial would require force, not narrative. The implications were clear. Suppressing discovery would mean choosing secrecy over science, power over people. The room fell silent. For the first time, the question was asked without disguise. What if silence causes more harm than truth? No one answered immediately. Sullivan felt the weight of that moment settle into memory. It was the first time he had seen certainty weaken. The guardians of the secret were beginning to doubt their own role. History had placed them in an impossible position, and time was running out. Outside those rooms, the world continued as normal. News cycles churned. Conflicts flared and faded. Humanity argued over borders and beliefs, unaware that the greatest challenge to its understanding lay beneath calm blue water. Sullivan's health declined faster now. Breathing became deliberate. Each day felt borrowed. With that urgency came clarity. He understood that waiting for consensus was another form of silence. And silence, he had learned, was not neutral. It shaped outcomes. He refined his testimony further, stripping it down to essentials. No speculation. No conclusions forced on the listener. Only sequence, pattern, and restraint. He wanted the truth to speak without panic, to arrive calmly, the way the cities beneath the Pacific had revealed themselves. What troubled him most was not fear of the unknown, but fear of denial. Humanity had always struggled more with humility than danger. Accepting that intelligence older and quieter than ours shared this planet would require maturity history had rarely shown. Chapter 5 ends with a choice still unresolved, a tension stretching quietly across years and institutions. The secret is no longer perfectly sealed. It is cracking under the weight of progress and conscience. The next chapter reveals the moment that changed everything, when an event occurred that could not be buried, dismissed, or rewritten, and forced the question no one wanted to answer. Stay with this story. Subscribe now, because what happens next brings the hidden world closer to the surface than ever before, and once that line is crossed, there is no returning to silence. The event that broke the pattern did not announce itself as historic. It arrived quietly, wrapped in routine, hidden inside a mission that was never meant to touch the truth. That was what made it impossible to erase. A multinational deep-sea survey was launched under environmental review, its purpose narrow and harmless on paper. Mapping thermal vents. Studying seismic stability. Nothing classified. Nothing secret. Its strength was its openness. Too many eyes. Too many institutions. Too many backups. For weeks, the expedition returned nothing unusual. Then, during a routine descent, the sensors registered a sudden change in pressure and temperature, sharp but controlled, not chaotic. The data did not resemble equipment failure. It resembled response. Minutes later, the feed changed. The ocean floor appeared smoother than expected, shaped rather than broken. Lines emerged, faint at first, then unmistakably deliberate. Patterns repeated at scale. Geometry replaced randomness. The drone slowed, not by command, but by influence. This time, the signal did not cut immediately. Footage streamed to multiple locations at once. Universities. Research partners. Cloud servers outside government reach. Engineers watched in silence as lights appeared again, not bright, not dramatic, but ordered. Calm. Familiar to those who had seen them before. For the first time, there was no clean way to contain the moment. Attempts were made. Legal pressure followed quickly. Requests for delay. Safety reviews. Urgent calls urging caution. But data has momentum once it spreads. Copies multiplied. Screenshots escaped. Questions formed faster than answers. Inside classified networks, the response shifted from control to damage limitation. The language changed again. Not whether the truth could be hidden, but how it would surface. Not if disclosure would happen, but who would frame it. Marcus Sullivan watched the situation unfold with a calm that surprised even him. The anxiety he had carried for decades eased into something steadier. The truth he had guarded was no longer alone. It had context now. Witnesses. Evidence. What unsettled him was the behavior of the deep itself. The lights did not advance. The structures did not rise. There was no attempt to communicate or repel. The civilization beneath the Pacific did not react like something exposed. It reacted like something acknowledged. As if recognition had always been part of the design. Restraint remained consistent. That restraint forced a new question into conversations that had once avoided it. What if the purpose of hiding was never fear of humanity, but patience with it? Public discussion began at the edges of media, cautious and speculative. Scientists disagreed openly. Some dismissed the footage as misinterpretation. Others hesitated, choosing words carefully. No one rushed to conclusions. But no one could fully dismiss what they had seen. The story gained gravity without spectacle. That made it harder to ridicule. Sullivan felt time closing in on his body, but expanding around the truth. He understood that disclosure would not arrive as a single announcement. It would unfold slowly, unevenly, resisted and reframed, but impossible to reverse. He finalized his testimony. Not to compete with the footage. Not to claim authority. But to add continuity. To show that what the world was beginning to see had been present all along. That the ocean had not changed. Only humanity's ability to notice had. Chapter 6 ends at the moment secrecy loses its center of gravity. Control no longer belongs to any one institution. The truth is moving on its own, guided by evidence, curiosity, and time. The next chapter reveals the first official acknowledgement, not of what exists beneath the Pacific, but of what humanity no longer controls. The acknowledgement did not arrive as a confession. It arrived as language. A single phrase appeared first, buried inside a routine government briefing, spoken carefully and repeated nowhere else. Unknown intelligent structures of non-natural origin. No explanation followed. No clarification was offered. The words were not meant for the public, but they were no longer fully controlled. That was the moment the silence officially ended. News outlets hesitated at first. Editors argued. Experts debated wording. The story hovered at the edge of credibility, too serious to mock, too unsettling to embrace fully. But the phrase spread anyway, carried by documents, recordings, and cautious reporting. The deep ocean, once described as empty and extreme, was suddenly framed as unexplored and active. Governments responded with restraint, not denial. That shift mattered more than any admission. When denial disappears, truth begins to surface on its own. Marcus Sullivan watched from a distance, his body weakening, his mind clearer than it had been in decades. He recognized the strategy immediately. Partial acknowledgement without context. Enough to prepare the ground, not enough to explain what had already been known for years. This was not disclosure. It was permission. Scientists were allowed to ask better questions now. Not openly, not freely, but without ridicule. Funding models changed. Language softened. What had once been impossible to suggest became cautiously discussable. The ocean floor was no longer assumed to be silent by default. Public reaction unfolded slowly. Fear did not dominate. Curiosity did. People wanted to know how long this had been hidden, who knew, and why the truth had waited so long. Trust became the real casualty. Not panic. Not belief. Trust. Sullivan understood that trust, once broken, never fully returns. That was why his testimony mattered. Not as proof, but as continuity. A record showing that this moment was not sudden, not accidental, and not new. He reviewed his files one last time. The mission details. The early patterns. The restraint shown again and again by what lived beneath the Pacific. A civilization advanced enough to remain unseen, intelligent enough to understand human reaction, patient enough to wait. What unsettled him now was not what humanity might do next, but how slowly it accepted responsibility for knowing. Discovery had always been framed as conquest. This discovery demanded humility. The ocean did not reveal itself through force. It allowed recognition. That difference mattered. Sullivan finalized his testimony with the same care he had used his entire career. No accusations. No emotional manipulation. Just sequence, consistency, and truth. He wanted the story to stand even when his voice could not. This chapter ends at the threshold of public awareness, where acknowledgement has begun but understanding has not yet followed. The truth is visible now, but still incomplete, still fragile, still vulnerable to distortion. And this is where you come in. If you have followed this story to this point, you are no longer just listening. You are witnessing a record being restored piece by piece. Stories like this survive only when people choose attention over distraction, curiosity over comfort. Once acknowledgement entered the public space, the world did what it always does with uncomfortable truth. It slowed it down. No emergency announcements followed. No unified explanation arrived. Instead, information was released in fragments, filtered through committees, softened by language, and wrapped in caution. The deep ocean was discussed more often now, but never clearly. Curiosity was allowed. Certainty was not. Scientific institutions responded carefully. Research proposals multiplied, each one phrased to avoid direct confrontation with what had already been implied. Funding arrived with conditions. Observation was encouraged. Interpretation was restrained. The line between discovery and permission remained tightly drawn. Marcus Sullivan watched this phase with quiet understanding. This was the longest part of any revelation. Not denial, not acceptance, but adjustment. Humanity was learning how to speak around the truth before speaking to it. What surprised many was the absence of fear. There were no mass reactions, no widespread panic. The public did not collapse under the weight of possibility. Instead, attention drifted toward responsibility. People wanted to know why the truth had been delayed, who decided silence was better than honesty, and what else might still be hidden. That question mattered more than the discovery itself. Inside restricted circles, the pressure shifted again. Officials who had once guarded secrecy began preparing narratives. Not to explain what existed beneath the Pacific, but to explain their own decisions. History was being rehearsed before it was written. Sullivan recognized the pattern. Institutions survive by reshaping memory. Without testimony, truth becomes flexible. That was why he could no longer wait. He recorded the final segments of his account with deliberate calm. He described the mission as it unfolded, the restraint shown by the hidden cities, the decades of quiet observation that followed. He did not accuse. He did not speculate. He allowed the sequence itself to carry meaning. What he emphasized most was not discovery, but behavior. At every encounter, the civilization beneath the ocean chose distance over dominance. Silence over force. Withdrawal over warning. That consistency suggested ethics, not instinct. It suggested awareness of consequence. The implication was subtle, but profound. Humanity had not been spared by weakness. It had been spared by choice. As Sullivan's strength faded, clarity sharpened. He understood that the truth was no longer about what lived beneath the sea. It was about how humanity responded when it realized it was not alone on its own planet. Whether it would approach with humility or repeat the same patterns of fear and control that had defined so much of its history. The world stood at a quiet turning point. One path led to deeper understanding, careful contact, and shared stewardship of a planet older and more complex than anyone had imagined. The other led to denial reshaped as authority, discovery treated as threat, and silence enforced until it failed again. This chapter ends with that choice unresolved. Because the next chapter reveals the moment Sullivan's testimony begins to circulate beyond his control, reaching audiences it was never meant for, and triggering reactions no one anticipated. Stay with this story. Subscribe now, because what follows is the most human part of all, the moment truth leaves institutions behind and enters the hands of ordinary people, where it can no longer be managed, only understood. The spread did not look dramatic from the outside. There was no single upload, no viral moment that announced itself as the turning point. Instead, the testimony moved the way truth often does when it escapes control, quietly, steadily, from one trusted hand to another. Fragments appeared first. A short clip here. A quoted paragraph there. Always incomplete, always careful. At first, few noticed. Then patterns formed. Different sources, different voices, all pointing back to the same core account. A mission in 1994. Impossible depths. Orderly lights. Long silence. Marcus Sullivan had expected resistance. What he did not expect was recognition. Former sailors reached out privately, not to argue, but to confirm. Scientists compared notes they had never shared publicly. Analysts re-examined data they had dismissed years earlier. The testimony did not feel new to them. It felt familiar, like something half-remembered finally given shape. Attempts to slow the spread followed, but they lacked conviction. Requests for takedown were cautious. Statements were vague. The machinery of control hesitated, unsure whether force would draw more attention than silence. That hesitation mattered. For the first time, the story existed outside institutions. Public discussion deepened, not widened. This was not entertainment. It was not spectacle. It was conversation. Thoughtful, measured, sometimes uncomfortable. People did not ask what the civilization beneath the Pacific wanted. They asked why it had waited, and why humanity had been afraid of knowing. That question cut deeper than denial ever had. Sullivan watched the reaction unfold with a calm that came from acceptance. His role was nearly complete. The truth no longer depended on his voice alone. It had witnesses now. Context. Memory shared instead of buried. He reflected often on the restraint shown by what lived beneath the ocean. Decades of opportunity to interfere, to warn, to dominate. None taken. Instead, patience. Distance. Observation. The more humanity learned, the clearer the contrast became. The hidden civilization had treated discovery as a responsibility. Humanity had treated it as a threat. That realization reshaped the conversation entirely. Some institutions began adjusting openly. Language shifted again, this time toward coexistence rather than containment. Others resisted, clinging to authority built on secrecy. The divide was no longer about belief. It was about trust. Sullivan's health declined sharply during this time. Each breath felt deliberate. Each recording session shorter than the last. Yet there was no urgency in his voice when he spoke. Only resolve. He knew the story would outlive him. That was enough. He left one final message unreleased, sealed with instructions. Not for immediate impact, but for continuity. A reminder that truth does not belong to those who discover it first, but to those willing to carry it responsibly. Chapter 9 ends with the story no longer hidden, but not yet complete. The world has heard enough to question, enough to doubt old narratives, enough to look at the ocean with new eyes. What remains is the final reckoning. Not with what lives beneath the Pacific, but with what humanity chooses to become now that silence is no longer possible. Do not walk away at this point. If you have followed this story through secrecy, doubt, and awakening, then you deserve to hear how it ends. Subscribe now, because the final chapter reveals Sullivan's last decision, the message he chose to release, and why the future of this truth depends not on governments or institutions, but on ordinary people willing to listen, remember, and act with humility. The story is almost complete. The choice it leaves behind is not. The final decision was not made in a room filled with officials or behind locked doors. It was made in quiet, ordinary moments, when the noise of reaction faded and only responsibility remained. Marcus Sullivan understood then that endings are rarely dramatic. They are deliberate. The sealed message he had prepared was not a revelation of new evidence. It was context. A thread that connected everything the world was beginning to see with what had been known for decades. Dates. Locations. Patterns. Restraint. He chose to release it not to shock, but to steady the truth before others shaped it for their own needs. When the message surfaced, it did not overturn governments or collapse institutions. Instead, it did something more enduring. It slowed the conversation. People listen differently. Scientists read more carefully. Journalists asked better questions. The tone shifted from reaction to reflection. Sullivan did not live to see where it would lead. His passing was quiet, reported briefly, noted without ceremony. Yet his testimony continued to move, carried by those who recognized its weight. Not as prophecy. Not as accusation. As record. What followed was not contact, not confirmation, not confrontation. It was humility. The slow realization that humanity had shared this planet far longer than it had understood, and that intelligence does not always announce itself with power. Sometimes it waits. The oceans remained calm. The lights beneath the Pacific did not rise. No message arrived. No warning followed. And in that restraint, the final truth became clear. Humanity had not reached the limit of knowledge. It had reached the beginning of responsibility. This story ends here, but what it points to does not. It lives in how questions are asked, how curiosity is handled, and how silence is interpreted going forward. The choice was never about discovery. It was about maturity. If you have followed this journey from secrecy to acknowledgement, from fear to understanding, then you already know why this story matters. Stories like this survive only when they are remembered, discussed, and carried forward with care. Subscribe to this channel, not just for what comes next, but for what must be watched closely. Because the deepest truths do not rise suddenly. They surface slowly, and only for those willing to pay attention.